So inspired right now.
Hello and welcome to the Media Play News Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Parkman.
And I'm co-host Charlie Sholey.
Right off the top, we just want to say that after this episode, the podcast will be going on a hiatus for the foreseeable future. But we will still have industry news to report on. But we still have industry news to report on. We'll check in on the writers and actors strike, but it's in a dead heat now, having crossed 100 days of striking for the WGA. Netflix and gaming resurfaces, with news that the streamer will open a small selection of games to stream to select markets in the UK and Canada. It says Charlie. You wrote that. You did it.
I know. I forgot to say, Charlie, what have you been up to this last month?
Charlie, what have you been watching since last episode?
Well, I only have one very important question for you. Are you a Barbie man or are you an Oppenheimer man?
Barbie all day.
Me too. I'm actually surprised how not interested I am in seeing Oppenheimer. It's probably just the residual negative feeling I have towards Christopher Nolan by being let down so hard with Tenet. Yeah, exactly. And just the criticisms I see about Oppenheimer, other than it has such a very sort of like special presentation in that, you got to go out and see it in IMAX 70 millimeter film. That's pretty cool. But for the most part, it's just a drama focusing around people talking.
Yeah.
And it's 3 hours long.
Yeah, dude.
And just some of like the sound editing or sound design in general, from what I've heard, there's kind of just like backgrounds score throughout basically the entire movie, which just is kind of like a pet peeve of mine when movies overuse music like that. Yeah. So just all these small things adding up that has me thinking, I don't really care about seeing Oppenheimer in theaters. I'll see it eventually, obviously, but
it's definitely a long weekend barbecue movie.
Yeah. But I did go out and see Barbie and it ruled. I thought it was going to be pretty good, but it was 10 times better than what I was expecting. And as it turns out, Ken steals the show. Ryan Gosling going against type with kind of his stoic, silent characters that he generally plays in like serious movies. Yeah. Polar opposite of that. Proving that he does indeed have a spectrum of roles that he can play.
Yeah, I think you gotta let actors get weird sometimes. To really see what they're about. Like, Hugh Jackman played Wolverine for 20 years. And then you give him something like The Greatest Showman, which is like back to what he was doing before. He's just having a grand old time. Yeah,
well, now he's going back to Wolverine again.
But maybe in the most fun being Wolverine that he's been able to do, since the X-Men movies are very self-serious.
You remember seeing pictures of Hugh Jackman in the very first X-Men?
Dude, I rewatched them.
He looks X-Men. Like a normal, slightly muscular guy.
Like, he's not even particularly fit. He's just 6'2". Like, he's just a tall guy. He's just an Australian. You're just like, oh yeah, that dude looks like an Australian dude looks. And like you can tell they kind of tried to make him look a little bit shorter with like the framing and like the clothes he wears and stuff. And then they give up on it. I was like, yeah, Hugh Jackman's 6'2", like whatever. Then he's jacked in the second one.
And it only gets more so from there.
By the Wolverine, he is so insanely muscular, but also 42 years old. So like, this can't be fun or comfortable, dog.
Yeah. So Barbie, huge recommendation. Not that I need to tell anyone listening. It's already made over $1 billion. Yeah,
really crazy money.
Well done, Greta Gerwig. And of course, Mattel is learning all the wrong lessons by greenlighting like 10 more of their properties to become movies. Yeah. So at home, I've been watching The Bear. It's on Hulu. Really great. Just a guy from a fine dining background tries to not open a restaurant. That's the second season, but his brother unexpectedly dies and he has to take over his restaurant in Chicago. Pretty stylish, more so than what you would think given the premise. So that's been a lot of fun. And then also I don't know how to classify this at all, but How To with John Wilson is coming back for apparently its final season on Max. And it's a guy who obsessively films everything he can around New York City and then somehow strings together. If I were to count the number of unique things you see in each episode of the show, it's something on the order of 300 different random scenes in any given day of New York. I don't know how he combines that with his voiceover of a very mundane topic like how to pick wine, for instance. And all of his stories just go off in really weird, unexpected ways. So How To with John Wilson, double thumbs up. How about you, though?
I also saw Barbie and deliberately did not see Oppenheimer. I don't think I have the patience for it. Coincidentally, another podcast I listened to had planned a Manhattan Project series, and it's very comprehensive across probably a total of 6.5 hours across 3 episodes. And I was like, well, I know the story. Like, I know what happened, and there's no way Christopher Nolan covers that story fully accurately, because it still has to serve as a film, and I know the kind of films that he writes and directs. So I was like, I'll catch it.
Yeah, I don't want the plot being told at me for 3 hours straight.
It'll be on something, not HBO, because he got real mad about Tenet being released, or not on Max. But yeah, we'll see. It'll show up somewhere, and I'll see it in passing and be like, yeah, that was fine. Florence Pugh looks good, and then just keep it pushing. I have been making more of an effort to see movies in theaters. I also saw The Haunted Mansion, which I genuinely enjoyed. I thought that it was a poor choice to release it in July, but similar, we were having a conversation before we started recording about, some kind of like pseudo conspiratorial, ideas about like film releases and things that are getting removed and added to services. And one of the discussions I saw about Haunted Mansion was, well, they're releasing it in July, and then it'll kind of flop. And then so that they can 90 days later release it at the beginning of October, so that for the actual time that it would hit. And so then you're paying what little, if any, residuals get paid for the film movie being streamed.
You're 100% right.
As opposed to what they would make from box office. So, but it's good. If you have the opportunity to see Haunted Mansion before it's out of theaters, I do recommend it as an experience. They do I think they take a ride with no story, or with a very loose story. There is a narrative to the California park. There's a deeper narrative, I believe, to the Tokyo version, which is not. Yeah, the Tokyo version. It's Hong Kong that has a completely different ride. The Tokyo version does have more of a narrative, if I recall correctly. But similar to, Jungle Cruise, which didn't need to exist. But there have been 2 other Haunted Mansion adaptations. There's the Eddie Murphy one from 2003, almost exactly 20 years ago. And in 2021, there was a Muppet Haunted Mansion film. Or not film, but a short. It's maybe 45 minutes. And they all do a slightly different thing around the same general, the loose idea presented by the ride. And I think that the most recent Haunted Mansion works really well as an effective kind of paranormal thriller. Is not really accurate because it is still a family movie, but it combines the action of what you want to see in a Haunted Mansion style movie, and actually adds a narrative that you can get into and kind of has a very resonant emotional core to it. And I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed Haunted Mansion. Barbie ripped. I loved watching Barbie. I've been meaning to see it again, but just haven't gotten around to it, and probably won't before it leaves theaters. But Barbie's very good, and in a way that I wasn't expecting.
As soon as it opened with sort of like a cinematography homage to 2001, I'm like, okay, this movie's going to be on another level.
I think it was the first trailer had about 30 seconds of that opening without the Meryl Streep narration over it. So I was like, that's kind of cool as a teaser if they don't have like stuff in the movie to show. I didn't realize it was going to be in the film, so I thought that was very cool. And like it was extended. And I had a feeling it was going to spend most of its time in Barbie world as opposed to doing like a, Cool World Roger Rabbit style where they're like, there's the fiction place initially and then they spend most of the time in the real world. And I was like, that feels like the most boring version of this story, and I feel like they're going to do it the other way. And they did, and it was fun. And yeah, I think Ryan Gosling being able to just be a weirdo works really well. And I think all of the Ken stuff was really interesting because it doesn't, I guess without getting too much into it, it doesn't go in the direction that you think it's going to when it starts to go in the direction that you think it's going to. A lot of the background acting, I think, is very good. Like, obviously, Ryan Gosling and Margot Robbie and America Ferrera are the leads. But a lot of the other characters, the other Barbies and Kens, have a lot of great, there's a lot of great supporting acting in that movie as well. It like kind of makes all of it work really well. I think the set design is incredible. Like the production overall of Barbie Land is so good. And it all feels very endearing. And if you didn't see Barbie, which statistically you probably did, you should definitely try to see it in theaters. And if not, definitely pick it up when you can watch it at home. And then at home, I've been rewatching Smallville, one of my favorite shows from my childhood. Watched all of season 1 and about half of season 2 since we last recorded, and it both holds up and does not hold up. It's all the stuff I remember from the early parts of the series are still good. And then there's a bunch of stuff I don't remember at all because it's bad. Like
how do the superhero effects hold up? Because I imagine not well.
So they rely very heavily on, for the like super speed, for like most of the stuff, they use a lot of slow motion. Some of the CG looks worse than others. Like if things are flying through the air, it's either slowed down really heavily so they can like use actual props, or it looks like it's 2001 because it is 2001. Smallville had an issue that a lot of like late 90s, early 2000s like science fiction and action series had, where their pilot looks really good because that's where all the money went, and then they were like, oh, we got a full 22 episode order. Now we have to meter out this budget for the next 21 episodes. But a lot of it, like I said, a lot of it holds up. I know that the effects don't get incredible because the series ended 12 years ago. So like, it's not like they got super far, and it was a network television show that got an increasing budget over time. But again, because it's a 22 episode, 45-minute series, that budget can only go so far. And you start to see it with costuming as they introduce more superheroes. A big, like with the Blue Beetle film coming out later this month, actually this upcoming weekend, there have been people rediscovering Blue Beetle's appearance on Smallville 12 years ago. Not a good costume. And not good CG either. They're really trying. I remember at the time thinking, this doesn't look good, but they're trying really hard. And you got to give them credit for that. They did try to do a lot of stuff practical, and that's why a lot of the CG is used like in between. But you can see the difference because a lot of it is practical. But I don't know. I'm enjoying revisiting this thing from my childhood. I haven't rewatched it. I've rewatched it once, and it was maybe a decade ago. So like right after it ended, I rewatched all of it. So I'm having a good time getting through it. But I have it on Blu-ray because I'm real serious about, this physical media push. So it was a birthday gift from my partner, or a Christmas gift from my partner, and it included a redemption code for you can get the digital version of this. The digital version though expires. The code just isn't good forever. Like it expired on December 31st of last year. I'm like, this is a weird.
That's rude.
Like I own it. I can get, a Blu-ray ripper and just have the digital files also. And doing it that way is legal because I do own it. But like, why would you give me the option, but have that option expire? Like, what does that do for you?
Yeah, without getting into too many details of how I consume some stuff digitally, I have never redeemed any of my digital copies of movies. So the fact they can expire is both shocking and surprising.
Yeah, and I mean,
why would they do this?
Like, it's not a physical object. You're just giving me access to a file that exists somewhere. But yeah, that's very frustrating. And, we can tie that into some conversation later. So, but before we get into all that, this week's inspiration is leftover grapefruit sculpin that Charlie has from his wedding.
Still. And then top shelf whiskey this time around. It's Whistle Pig.
Their 10-year barrel age. It's real good.
It is quite good. I'm trying to make this glass last the entire episode.
We're both drinking it neat on a honestly pretty nice day. It has not been it hasn't been as warm today as it has been the last couple of days, which is nice. So it's a nice, chill last episode for a while. Time with our inspiration. But getting into the stories, as we said in the intro, the writer's strike has officially crossed its 100th day as of last week. Nightly talk shows remain on hiatus, and indefinite production halts continue to mount. The hardline stances of streaming executives are starting to soften. Last month's episode featured Disney CEO Bob Iger calling the strikes very disruptive, but now has changed his tone to hoping both sides can find solutions to the issues of residual pay and fears about AI. Interestingly, a lack of production has led to increased free cash flow for companies, with Disney netting $1.6 billion last quarter thanks to a combination of workforce reductions and the temporary pause on paying actors and writers. This expected increase in free cash flow could continue through the end of the year if the strikes don't stop. But this short-term gain will eventually lead to fiscal pain if production doesn't resume.
I did rhyme that on purpose.
Can you give me the timestamp on that so I can find it easier in the edit?
Yeah, 2050.
Okay, 2050. I'll remember that. So yeah, it's been very interesting, especially since we talked about last month, since SAG-AFTRA has joined the strike as well.
Yeah, I actually think it's surprising that any of these companies are celebrating, hey, we're saving a lot more money since we don't have to pay for production, in that they are definitely going to have to pay for that further down the line when the strikes eventually conclude and all production has to come back.
And also, last time this happened, in 1960, the studios had to pay residual, they had to pay back pay for the time that the strike was active, which is not unreasonable to think that will happen this time around, given what the primary points of contention are regarding residuals and loss of wages over things like that. It's interesting because in previous situations where either one of the unions was leading up to a strike or was already actively striking, in 2007 and I believe 1994, things like studio heads would studio boards would kind of leak stuff to industry, like magazines and like internal like newspapers and stuff, like newsletters to kind of
they wanted to control the narrative,
right, and kind of spook the talent, but like that stuff wasn't really public unless you were looking for it,
right?
And I think some of that behavior is still here, but in the age of the internet, where you can say like, we're going to try to hold this out until people start losing their homes, goes viral because he said it to an industry insider who put it on a website.
Oh yeah, it goes public immediately. And of course, now that actors have joined the groups striking, you know, for the most part, if you don't follow this stuff, you're not really going to care too much about writers not working. But actors, as like the front line of what people see when they're actually watching stuff, of course, their social media followings are going to be way higher. Yeah. So anything that they share that works in their favor or against the production companies, people are just going to pick up immediately.
Yeah.
So that point got brought up in this interview with the actor writer Adam Conover. He's one of the spokespeople and negotiator for the writers and actors on strike.
Yeah, he's on the board. He's on the SAG-AFTRA board of negotiation.
Yeah. So that one funny thing he brought up in this interview, and we'll link to it in the show notes, was one thing with the production companies saying that the demands being made about pay and stuff were unreasonable, and then the writers and actors just taking pictures of their residual checks and saying, actually, in this show that gets millions of views, my residual check is $500.
Yeah, a recent one of those that came out was the writing staff for the show Suits, which aired on TNT initially, but is having a random resurgence on Netflix. It's doing incredibly well for Netflix right now. The entire writing staff made in residuals, based on like the last couple months of the show kind of popping off again, made a combined $3,000. It's like some people were making like $250.
Nothing.
For a show that's did well when it was on network television and is doing well again in streaming. But there wasn't the negotiation then, because the last time this happened was 2007, right before Netflix happened. So pivoted into streaming. Netflix is obviously already a company. We talked about it on our inaugural episodes. But there wasn't like a point of concern, because even Netflix at the time was distributing DVDs. So like there was physical purchases of physical media being distributed, and that was already like there were deals in place for home media. So it's very interesting seeing that. And I listened to another interview. So Charlie sent me the one that we were talking about, and I listened to another interview with Adam Conover on a show called Daily Zeitgeist, which is primarily a news podcast, and they frequently have people who are, have more behind the camera roles, writers and producers and things like that, like other people in the entertainment industry that aren't necessarily camera facing. But they had Adam on right at the beginning, maybe the week after the acting guild, like SAG-AFTRA, also joined the strike, and he went over a lot of the examples of like why this kind of thing is important, using other industries and other regions as examples. Like we talked before about, even before all of this, Netflix's push into South Asian and East Asian markets, as far as like, a lot of film and television from India and South Korea, and propping up those markets and using, distributing that content throughout. But there are like a number of like articles and things that you can go out and read that are about how, like, the guy who made Squid Game was paid, I think, $200,000 initially, after 10 years of trying to get this thing made, and Netflix was the studio that decided to, invest it in doing that. But now, like, I don't remember the exact number, but he's getting basically nothing in residuals. He's paid his initial amount for the concept. Then it was further developed through Netflix's production arm into a series. And by things like that in those markets, because those markets aren't unionized. There isn't collective action. There aren't the same. They don't have the same ability to leverage collective action in those markets. And so,
which I'm going to say right now, Netflix and other global streaming companies like that are going to use that to their advantage. Not in the sense that they don't want to make stuff with people who are part of unions here, but just as a matter of, well, if we can't use actors in the US to make stuff, seeing as how we're kind of like in the business of global entertainment now, let's just make more stuff in South Korea.
Yep. Or even the UK and Australia and like areas where maybe there's not as much post-production going in, like, doing dubbing or subtitles or adjusting media for
it's great for us as the consumers, but for the US based actors, maybe not so much. That was one issue that I had with the points that Adam Conover was making in the interview, was that he seemed to hold up movies and TV as kind of like the epitome of the type of entertainment that people like us want to consume. Mm-hmm. And just personally, I think that's kind of him having a higher opinion of his profession than is realistic.
Yeah.
It's not like everything made is terrible nowadays, but it ignores the fact that, for instance, video games as an industry generate 5 times the revenue that movies do these days. And then him making some comment of like, maybe Twitch is popular, but it's a low cost, low effort form of entertainment, which is like, I'm not sure that you, Adam Conover, could entertain an audience of thousands of people for 10 hours straight, on 6 days a week.
Consistent basis.
It's a very different form of entertainment, but to cast it down to say that like movies are the number one thing people are following,
to be all end all.
It felt a little out of touch. That being said, these actors and writers are being screwed over by streaming.
Yeah, and I think that kind of thing happens because, like, in the interview, the Daily Zeitgeist interview, he was similarly reductive about YouTube content, and I did think that was interesting, considering a lot of his early viral work was for College Humor, which pivoted to YouTube at the same time everybody else did. And he still did a lot of work with them on YouTube, and that, leveraged that into other positions like his True TV show and things like that. It is fundamentally different, I'll say, but I think it does underestimate how many people are consuming YouTube content as their primary form of like content consumption, myself included.
Me too. One very illuminating thing that came up when everything shut down a few years ago during COVID was everything that sort of relied on centralized production in the sense of like TV shows and talk shows and stuff like that. The quality immediately fell off a cliff. Not because the people working on those productions aren't talented, but just because their means of producing their type of content was completely disrupted. Whereas everyone who made YouTube stuff professionally, their quality was exactly the same.
Yeah, a lot of people were already accustomed to working independently or with a handful of contractors. If you're like at like kind of a median level where you're writing your own scripts and you're doing your own filming and then maybe hiring someone to help edit or doing like all the editing depending on like what level you're at. I listened to a couple of podcasts with YouTube creators. This is about YouTube now. I listened to a couple of podcasts with like YouTube creators, and they'll have other YouTube creators on and they'll talk about kind of like what their process has been of like transitioning from, because like it is being able to have a career in YouTube, like making independent video content, is relatively recent, like the last maybe decade. even though YouTube had already been a thing for a while and there were a lot of people doing things before the Google acquisition, which wasn't too long after YouTube launched, but it did still take a while for ad revenue to start making its way directly to creators in the same way that it can now, as opposed to then where it was like YouTube like, hey, here's the number of impressions that you've resulted in. Here's just a check for what we decided that value is. And now it's more, there's a percentage that creators get from YouTube above a certain threshold, as well as direct brand integration and how people are approaching that and having to kind of navigate content creation independently as a business. So a lot of people who are like registering businesses in order to like more effectively kind of navigate that kind of thing. And I think that we'll probably, there we go, tied it back. I think we'll probably see a similar thing with independent content creation in the next 5 to 10 years, because there are so many people who are using, as of right now, are kind of limited to an extent by their platform. So like using YouTube as your primary outlet for content creation, or using Twitch, like if you're a streamer, there's only so many options that you have that are like financially viable and are also being held up on the backs of those creators. Like you can't Kickback or like Kick, was it Kick that was the one that
the new streaming platform that just paid some guy like $100 million.
Yeah.
Like that's what you're talking about?
Yeah. So like Kick doesn't have, like Kick and like Twitch and that failed one that Microsoft tried to launch when they hired.
I can't remember the name now.
It came and went so quickly, and like they had Ninja, who was like the #1 Twitch streamer. Like they signed an exclusive deal, and like he jumped over to Microsoft's whatever, and then it was gone in 6 months, and he was just like, back on Twitch, baby. But like that kind of thing is kind of built on the time and effort of these creators who don't really have a lot of direct support from the platform. They just kind of use that platform as their outlet. And I think Mixer.
I remembered that. It's not because I just Googled it.
And it's a very forgettable name. So I'm not surprised. I think Kick's probably going to, be in the same boat, because while they did initially advertise themselves as like, we're less restrictive than Twitch, we can like kind of do our own thing in different ways. One of the first big creators they got over there was like, hey, I'm going to stream and comment on The Dark Knight, the film.
Hey, it's fair use, man.
And Kick was immediately like, hey, don't do that. We cannot afford to argue with Warner Brothers. And immediately was like, oh, well, I guess it's not that different from the other platform that everyone already uses. So it'll be interesting when like Twitch and YouTube in particular are probably going to be approached by a lot of their creators. Like, hey, look, we do X, Y, and Z for like through using your platform as the outlet, but our like ability to influence the outlet, like, the platform itself and how the platform is monetized and how that kind of makes its way to us is not working. Like, it's not fair and like in terms of how like that exchange goes. And so there might be some, I could see very easily in the next couple of years, some like collective action on the side of solo creators approaching some of these larger platforms like TikTok and Instagram as well, since they do also have financial partner programs through the platform directly. So yeah, that was like, well, like Adam he's very good at getting a point across. He like, especially breaking it down in a way that someone who's not connected into the industry can understand.
Yeah, I mean, like one important point he made to like bring it all back to the writers and actors strike was getting into the like backroom mechanics of why this strike happened in the first place.
Yeah.
Apparently, there's an organization called the AMPTP, the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. This is a group that negotiates on behalf of studios and production companies.
Yeah.
And apparently, one of their stipulations for handling all that negotiation is like on the production side saying your costs will not increase more than X percentage each year. So when the writers and actors come to the studios, or rather the AMPTP is the negotiating proxy, and say we're not being compensated enough, this organization doesn't have the authority to raise their wages enough because they've already promised that that is not going to happen to the studios. So just by virtue of the actors and writers being told no with no negotiation room whatsoever, that leads to, well, I guess now we have to strike.
Yeah, it's a real unstoppable force, immovable object situation. But we'll see how it shakes out. Again, the writers are over 100 days in now.
Yeah, I mean, where I see this ending is kind of like the likely outcome, and then my hopeful like asterisk to that outcome is I definitely expect $5 price increases on all of our streaming subscriptions.
An additional $5 increase as they slowly over the last since COVID happened, almost everything has gone up by at least $3, if not a full $5 at this point.
Look, you're getting access to a full library of content streamed over the internet to your house. You don't have to leave or do anything. Just pay the extra $5, okay?
That I'm viewing 0.05% of in most cases, and I'm still paying a separate provider for access to the internet.
Yeah. So I definitely see that happening long term. And what I hope is one of the outcomes of this, as a partial, like, something tacked on to movies getting released recently, like big budget, high profile movies, with the exception of Barbie and Oppenheimer, which have both done very well. There's been like several movie releases this year, Haunted Mansion being one, in the sense of I know about it, so it was advertised enough for me to be aware of its release. But also Indiana Jones, Mission Impossible, the most recent one, 2 of the Marvel releases this year, all of them quote unquote losing money or being quote unquote box office bombs. Yeah, just in the sense that they did not make $1 billion.
Yeah. But
they were all cost, $250 million to make, and then maybe an additional $250 million to market.
Yeah.
I really, really, really hope that the norm becomes a regression back to like $50 to $70 million releases with more unique plots and things that aren't necessarily just like franchises.
Yeah.
Let's make movies a little more unpredictable and fun to go to get people going back out to the theaters.
Yeah, because like a lot of what's happening with like things that are being made now, like over the last 6-7 years, is there's like attachment to franchises, and as a result, you're getting either remakes or direct sequels to movies that came out during this period where you could make Ghostbusters for $40 million in the early 80s, and its return would be $200 million, and that's a huge return.
Yeah, I mean, like, horror movies are the only genre that still adhere to that idea.
And even like, the one that came to mind from like a relatively more recent film that did result in a franchise, but like Men in Black, for example, $90 million brought in almost $600 million on like a weird idea that's wildly divergent from its source material, like as a independent comic, and like as an interesting idea that was fully adapted from like completely different origin, but works really well and was able to be successful even with a relatively modest budget for a sci-fi film coming out in the 90s. And like by contrast, Haunted Mansion's budget was $150 million, which I'm not going to look up what the, inflation adjustment for that is. They might be comparable. But Haunted Mansion, and it's I just had it open. Haunted Mansion made, and this is only hurting me because I have to edit. So on a $150 million budget, made $75 million.
Oh my God.
In its first 2 weeks.
That's even less than I thought.
Which is like rough. But again, released during the writer strike, so there's almost no promotion. Or during the actor strike, so there was promotion up to the acting strike, and that isn't, they're not members of SAG-AFTRA, aren't allowed to promote during the strike.
Yeah, that actually touches on another point that I wanted to make, in the sense of, are movies scheduled to be released? Will they get delayed on account of the actors not being able to promote them?
Yeah.
So Haunted Mansion is one that they probably weren't going to move at all because it was imminent to be released.
Yeah.
Only a couple months into the strike. But something like Dune Part 2 coming out in November, I have heard murmurings. Oh, what if Dune 2 is delayed? And from what I've researched, those types of movies, the amounts that the studio would lose in the extra marketing push from, the stars not being able to promote the movie, they would lose a lot more by delaying the movie, just because it disturbs the scheduling that's been put out, in the sense of like, an IMAX tier movie like Dune 2. The first Dune made 20% of its money back just from IMAX showings alone.
Jesus.
So it introduces like a lot more complications and likely losses in returns by just delaying these movies for the sake of, oh no, we're not producing anything more.
Yeah.
Let's delay this movie, and then what are we going to put out instead?
Right, which we actually just saw with when COVID happened. And there was that, like, because no one knew kind of what the full ramifications of a global pandemic was going to be, especially as it was moving into different areas of the globe and affecting them in different ways. Some places were locking down immediately, other places weren't. Even just within the US, that was kind of up in the air depending on what region you were in and what your state guidelines were. And studios are making the decision to, we're going to release stuff to streaming and just kind of see how it does. But then ran to the same thing. We're like, contractually, we've got to release this in theaters. So we had stuff like Black Widow getting released and flopping.
Yeah, I mean, if there's ever an example of movies making less money being released straight to streaming rather than having a theatrical release first, it's the fact that Scarlett Johansson sued Disney for them releasing Black Widow to Disney Plus.
Yeah.
The one movie I'd say that came out ahead was Tom Cruise's Top Gun Maverick being, held in stasis by the power of Tom Cruise's star power alone, and then coming out and making all the money, allowing the military to build an additional entire 3 fighter jets
that we'll also never see the end. But that was it's a recent comparable, like incredibly recent comparable situation where it's like, well, what is that gamble? And Marvel and Disney kind of lost that gamble with Black Widow, but arguably like Shang-Chi got delayed until later, which maybe speaks to confidence in each of those respective projects based on pre-production reels and test audiences and stuff like that. But regardless, we did see some films saw success, like children's films in particular saw a lot of success, but that was when children were home. They couldn't go anywhere, so parents were looking for anything. So a movie like Trolls World Tour can make $350 million in home PPV as opposed to maybe making $200 million, which is still incredible, especially for an animated film. But it would have made probably closer to 150 to 200.
Oh yeah, that was back when theatrical releases released on streaming instead had a paywall in front of them, huh?
Yeah, where you could HBO Max back when it was still HBO Max. And I think Disney was doing as well, where you could pay a premium to get access to a theatrically released movie at the same time. HBO Max did release a handful, like they released Wonder Woman 1984 and Godzilla vs. Kong, like for free directly to, like with no premium directly to the streaming. So if you already had HBO Max, which had only just launched 3 months before the lockdown happened, it had planned, like Warner Brothers had planned most of those films to be huge at their respective times of release, and made the decision to release them both, directly to streaming. And who knows, in those situations, I definitely would have enjoyed Godzilla vs. Kong more had I seen it in a theater, because it is not, I talked about it already. That'll be a whole different discussion. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see like what happens, because some studios have already made the decision, like, Blue Beetle had already been delayed. It was supposed to come out earlier this year and was pushed back, but that was unrelated to either of the strikes. Like same thing with, like Haunted Mansion. Like these decisions were made before the strike was in place. It was happening. But now there are movies that we know were on the slate for this year and early next year. And studios are definitely going to have to kind of roll the dice on, do we release it anyway without the same level of promotion, or do we hold off until we can promote it? And will that, like you said, how much do they stand to lose in the face of that?
Look, just stop spending $500 million on making and promoting movies.
Yeah, $100 million and less. Like there's so many ideas out there. There's so many people who are doing stuff that could be made into interesting projects. And just like we had in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember if I said this in the last episode, but it bears repeating, even if I did say it before. Instead of taking $200 million and investing all that into a single movie, just take 10 promising directors and give them $20 million each and final cut on their movies. And the cultural impact you as a studio are going to have is going to be far greater than what you would have from whatever your $200 million movie was.
Yeah, there's a reason. I mean, there are a number of reasons that A24 is getting. They're getting waivers for being able to make their movies happen, because they're doing the thing that there are the number of things that both the writers and actors guilds are requesting of larger studios. And they're like, well, as long as you're doing those things, you can still, like, union members are permitted to participate in those projects. So A24 has several projects that are still happening. There are some writers and actors who are choosing not to go forward, even with films that have waivers, as a show of solidarity for projects that aren't going forward and like the lives that affects. But it does say something that it can be done and is being done by some production companies. Yeah,
I mean, just imagine if there were 10 A24 tier studios
who were like making things that like they have the recognition from like the audience, like, hey, they make quality things, and you can trust that like what they do, like Pearl and X both came out within like a year of each other or something like that, and like both had under $30 million budgets. Both did incredibly well. I'll never see either of them because I'm a big baby coward, but like,
yeah, their new movie Talk to Me looks great. I will also never see that.
So yeah, I mean, fingers crossed there is another, like, we get another resurgence like we did in the 80s and 90s, where like interesting original ideas are being produced, and we're getting a lot of them. Or like even like into the late 90s and early 2000s, where there was like that big resurgence in comedies, because studios were like, here's $30 million to do improv with your friends. And it worked. Like, we got stuff like Anchorman and I Love You Man and things like that. So there's no telling right now, because all this is still going on and we won't really know.
We'll be leaving it on cliffhanger.
Just like a bunch of shows that were produced up to the strike and now will not be getting conclusions.
Moving into the gaming streaming side of things, Netflix it's expanding its gaming footprint by bringing games to TVs, PCs, and Macs. Do you remember when we were talking about games on Netflix?
Yeah.
And we were shocked that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge was licensed to be played on phones.
On mobile devices.
Through Netflix.
Exclusively through Netflix. It was not available anywhere else.
Bizarre. This limited test will only include 2 games for now, Oxenfree and Molehue's Mining Adventure. I've only heard of one of those.
I've heard of Oxenfree.
Yeah, based on the tone of how I said it, you can guess which one I've heard of too. But it continues the trend of Netflix's attempt to monetize and monopolize all of its users' free time, which sounds a lot more sinister when I say it out loud. But regardless, it's only select users in the UK and Canada who will have access to these games for now. And I mean, I follow gaming industry news pretty closely too, and I hear so little about game streaming technology.
Yeah.
Never mind Netflix game streaming.
Right, just game streaming in general.
Yeah. I'd say the highest profile streaming news I've heard related to games is how Google's Stadia project shut down only a year or two after it got announced.
Last long. You remember the Ouya from like almost 10 years ago? That was like the real like first high profile entrance into like, it was effectively like bringing PC gamers to like the console user base, or like using PC infrastructure for like game launchers, but being primarily focused on like using a controller for everything. And the Ouya failed quickly and loudly. Yeah,
like from a technology perspective, it's impressive that console and PC quality games can be streamed without needing that tech to be run locally.
Yeah.
However, number one, it's a single-digit percentage. It is a low single-digit percentage of Netflix users who even engage with their games in the first place. And on top of that, the few times that I have tried to use any kind of game streaming platform, the input lag, the time between hitting a button on your controller and having that action rendered on screen is so noticeable, even though it's only a fraction of a second. The fact that I notice it, you are not supposed to have that delay.
Yeah, I have. So you already all know about how many streaming services I'm paying for just for media.
Hey, those are all going up $5, buddy.
Can't wait. Can't wait to spend $100 a month instead of $70 a month by the end of all of those increases. But I also have Xbox Game Pass Ultimate, which is Microsoft's premium game subscription. Includes access to a wide library of games for both the Xbox series of consoles and PC, as well as whatever the top tier PlayStation subscription is. So I'm spending so much money.
PlayStation
on media.
Plus now, maybe.
Yeah, whatever it's called. Who cares? Spending too much money on it. But the PlayStation 1 has the PlayStation Premium service, like the tier that I have, includes their Classics collection, which includes things up to PS4 releases. So for a lot of like single player early generation games like PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, as well as a handful of PlayStation Portable titles, those can be streamed, but like their relative data size, like what they need to do to get it to your console, not a huge deal. I played through some of the PlayStation 2 Ratchet & Clank games, no problem. Tried to play a couple of PlayStation 4 titles, and it was, like you said, not a huge gap, but enough that it was like, this is detrimental to my playing experience. And I have the best internet I've had in a long time. Another premium service I'm paying for.
Hey, whoa, internet is a necessity.
And yet it is not nationalized.
Different discussion.
So I'm paying like a decent amount for internet, and my internet is fast. Like I'm able to do a lot over the internet. And even for the PlayStation 5, arguably the most powerful home console on the market, even with very good internet, streaming larger scale games, and even like moderate scale games, like even some PS3 titles I've attempted, it's not feasible.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fundamentally different problem than streaming media of some kind.
Yeah, like largely, if you're streaming a show or a movie, there can be like moderate variations in the video quality because there is like a buffering time, and that buffering time is invisible. You're not unless you're having a particular network issue, whatever system you're using to stream is at least a couple of seconds ahead of what you're watching. You mostly notice like kind of a downturn if you try to fast forward through something, and then you'll see like, oh, well, the quality dips for a little bit while it catches up. With gaming, I mean, it's got to be as close to 1-to-1 as you can get.
Yeah. It has to be basically instant. And the fact that these companies, not just, Netflix trying to break into streaming, or Google, the internet, as most people would interact with it. Amazon has a streaming service, Xbox, like you said, Sony, their PlayStation stuff.
Yeah.
I do not see a future where it's just as fast to send my button input signal to some data center that's running the game remotely and streaming it back to me.
Right.
And then having that rendered on screen, on par with just having a controller and running it, on some system that I have.
Yeah. At most via Bluetooth from your couch to your console.
Yeah. Like the business use case of it, it's totally obvious. Not only is it super easy to open up the market to much more people because they don't have to buy a dedicated piece of hardware anymore, but people don't own the individual games that they're playing. They just pay for access to a library of games that already exist.
Right.
i.e., these companies don't have to invest in making more games that people are playing.
Yeah.
I just, prove me wrong, but I don't see how games are going to get over that input lag problem.
Yeah, I think we're a ways off from that being even close to comparable. And even that, like the infrastructure that it seems like that would require is a lot. Like even with traditional gaming, doing that online, input lag is a problem because you are having to coordinate that kind of thing across the internet. And that's when the console is doing most of the work already.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of like thinking about it off the top of my head, with the way that smart TVs have a bunch of streaming service apps bundled into them.
Yeah.
They basically function like, worse smartphones.
Yeah. They can only be updated to a certain point based on what the infrastructure of the television itself is.
Yeah. Compute gets more and more efficient over time. So perhaps there's some sort of future where the PlayStation 9 is able to have a stripped down version, which just lives inside the TV that people have already. And it's able to handle, a bunch of local stuff, which solves that input lag problem. And there's some sort of like data center backup, which does some sort of like heavy lifting the game needs.
Yeah.
All that is speculation. I have no idea what I'm talking about, but with the way that the game streaming industry works right now, again, like I'll caveat it and say that these companies are building the technology that is going to make this entire sub industry work.
Yeah.
Much in the same way that Facebook is doing their VR stuff, or, most people write it off until I bully them into using the headset, and they're like, wow, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen.
Very cool, and you still bust it out every couple of weeks to play Beat Saber for 4 hours and realize that you're exhausted.
Yeah, but, they are laying the tracks on which their locomotive is currently running on.
Yes.
So, fast forward another 10 years, we'll see where game streaming goes. But I wish Netflix all the luck in the world because realistically, they're going to shut down their gaming division. I'm sorry, but I know how these things typically end.
Look, it hasn't worked out for anybody yet. So we'll see how this keeps trucking. But that's going to wrap us up for this run of the show. You can find links to these articles in the show notes and at MediaPlayNews.com. And you can subscribe to the site's mailing list using the subscription link in the notes. Stay subscribed because you never know when we're going to drop something else. We may resume regular production at some point in the near future or distant future. We might drop some specialty episodes like we did at the beginning of the show's run. So, just don't just don't deliberately unsubscribe. And if you see something from us in the future, you'll see it. This is where it'll be. But you can still email us directly at MediaPlayNewsPodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, we still appreciate a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. We really appreciate it. I'm Charles Parkman.
I'm Charlie Sholey.
And thank you for listening.